There's a version of Italian food everyone thinks they know. Spaghetti and meatballs, lasagna layered with cheese, rich sauces simmered with meat for hours. But that version didn't exist in 1920s Little Italy. Not for the people who actually lived there. When Italian immigrants crowded into the tenements of New York, they didn't arrive with recipes written in cookbooks. They arrived with empty pockets, tired hands, and mouths to feed. They arrived speaking little English, working brutal jobs, and living 6 or 7 people to a room. And they still had to eat. So they cooked. But not the food you see in restaurants today. Not the romantic version. Not the polished version. They cooked survival food. Food made to stretch. Food made to last. Food made from scraps, leftovers, peels, bones, cans, and bread that was already going hard. This was food that turned a nickel into dinner for 6. Food that used everything, because wasting anything meant going hungry tomorrow. Food that didn't look pretty, didn't photograph well, and didn't survive into nostalgia. And because of that, most of it has been forgotten, erased. Nobody put these dishes on menus. Nobody wrote them into cookbooks. They weren't meant to impress. They were meant to keep families alive. But inside those cramped kitchens, something powerful was happening. Mothers stood over stoves for hours. Fathers came home exhausted. Children learned early what scarcity meant and how to live with dignity anyway. These meals smelled like garlic in narrow hallways. They tasted like patience, sacrifice, and hope. They weren't just food, they were lessons. Lessons about thrift, about resilience, about making something meaningful out of almost nothing. Today, we're bringing those meals back. Not the fantasy, not the polished version, the real one. 30 foods Italian immigrants actually ate in 1920s Little Italy, New York. The food that history forgot, but families never did. Let's begin. 1. Pasta with garlic, oil, and breadcrumbs. Aglio, olio e mollica. The dish of dignity. There is a reason this dish survived when so many others disappeared. Because it wasn't just food, it was philosophy. In the cramped tenements of 1920s Little Italy, pasta with garlic, oil, and breadcrumbs wasn't eaten because it was trendy or traditional. It was eaten because it was possible. Families lived 5, sometimes 6 people to a single room. Kitchens were barely kitchens at all. A stove shoved against a wall, a small table, 1 pan, 1 pot. And in that space, mothers cooked meals that had to stretch. Pasta was cheap. Not the good pasta, not the kind you see today. The broken ends, the miscuts, the leftover bits sold for pennies. But pasta was filling, and it lasted. Olive oil wasn't poured generously the way it is now. It was measured carefully, poured slowly, watched closely. Garlic was cheap, strong, powerful. 1 clove could flavor an entire pot. And bread was life. Every household had bread, even if it was rock hard, even if it was days old. That stale bread was never thrown away. It was grated, crumbled, crushed by hand, then toasted in a dry pan until golden and fragrant. When sprinkled over pasta, it became poor man's cheese, not because it tasted like cheese, but because it replaced it. Cheese cost money. Breadcrumbs did not. And when families sat down to eat this dish, nobody called it sad. Nobody complained. The pasta was hot. The garlic filled the room. The oil coated every bite. The breadcrumbs added crunch. It tasted complete. This dish was eaten 3, sometimes 4 times a week. Children grew up thinking this was normal. Years later, when they had money, when they could afford Parmesan, many of them still made it with breadcrumbs, not out of necessity, but memory. Because this dish represented something deeper. refusing to feel defeated, making something honest from almost nothing, turning scarcity into nourishment. It wasn't survival food in the sense of desperation, it was survival food with pride. And that pride mattered. In a world that treated immigrants as disposable labor, this meal said, "We may be poor, but we eat well in our own way." 2. Beans stewed with tomato skins. Nothing wasted, ever. Sunday was sacred in Little Italy. Not because it was easy, but because it was the one day families cooked something special. Tomato sauce simmered for hours. Real tomatoes, peeled by hand, crushed, stirred slowly. But when the sauce was finished, the peels remained. And those peels were not trash. In immigrant kitchens, waste was a luxury no one could afford. Tomato skins were collected, saved in bowls or jars. Later in the week, when the sauce was gone, when the cupboard was nearly empty, those skins became the foundation of another meal. Dried white beans were soaked overnight. Beans were cheap, dependable, filling. Into a pot they went with water, garlic, salt, and those saved tomato peels. No meat, no fat, just time. The pot simmered for hours. Slowly the skins softened. Whatever flavor they had left seeped into the water. The beans absorbed it all. The result was thin, watery, but familiar. It tasted like tomatoes. It tasted like Sunday, even though it was Wednesday. Children ate this with bread. Thick slices of stale bread dunked into the broth. The liquid soaked in, turning scraps into sustenance. This dish taught a lesson that stayed with people for life. Everything has value, even the parts others throw away, especially those parts. It wasn't about being cheap. It was about respect. Respect for food, respect for labor, respect for the effort it took to earn every ingredient. This was how immigrant families survived without bitterness. They learned gratitude through repetition, through pots of beans
Everything
made
has
from
value,
peels and patience.
even the parts others.
3. Old bread soaked in coffee or milk. Breakfast of the tenements. Morning came early in Little Italy. Fathers left before sunrise. Mothers were already awake. Children slept 3 to a bed, and breakfast was not an event. It was a necessity. There were no eggs most mornings, no meat, no cereal, just bread. Bread that was too hard to chew on its own, so it was soaked. Chunks of stale bread went into bowls. Hot coffee poured over it. Weak coffee, stretched with water. If milk was available, it was used. Sometimes there was only hot water with a spoon of sugar. The bread softened. The liquid warmed it. And that was breakfast. Children ate it quickly before school or work. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't comforting. But it filled the stomach just enough. This wasn't neglect. This was reality. Every family on the block was eating the same thing. Italian, Irish, Jewish. Everyone was struggling. And there was comfort in that shared hardship. Breakfast wasn't about joy. It was about endurance. And somehow, it worked. 4. Fried dough scraps, turning leftovers into joy. Bread baking day was special, not because there was abundance, but because there were leftovers. Small scraps of dough, too little to form a loaf, too valuable to waste. Oil was heated, carefully. The scraps were dropped in. They puffed. They browned. They became something new. Children gathered around the stove. Fingers burned. Laughter filled the room. No sugar, no honey. Just hot, salty, fried dough. And it felt like a treat. This was emotional cooking. Mothers understood that food wasn't just fuel, it was morale. Fried dough scraps were proof that joy could exist even in poverty. Fathers came home tired. They smelled the oil. They saw their children smiling. And for a moment, the exhaustion felt lighter. 5. Pasta with sardines. Protein from a can. Fresh fish was impossible. No ice, no storage, no money. But sardines came in cans. Cheap, salty, strong. One can could flavour an entire pot of pasta. The sardines were broken up, mixed with oil, garlic, breadcrumbs. The pasta absorbed everything. It tasted rich. It tasted intentional. This dish connected immigrants to coastal Italy, to fishing villages, to memories of home, even if the fish came from a tin. It was adaptation, survival, tradition evolving under pressure. And it worked. 6. Escarole and white bean pot, the meal that lasted all week. This was not a single dinner. This was a strategy. In Little Italy, cooking wasn't just about feeding people. It was about planning. Fuel cost money. Time cost money. So when a woman cooked, she cooked big. One pot, enough to last days. And escarole with white beans was the perfect dish for that purpose. Escarole was cheap, bitter, tough, the kind of green that didn't wilt into nothing. White beans were even cheaper, bought dry in bulk, soaked overnight in cold water, swollen and ready by morning. Together, they formed the backbone of working-class survival. The pot went on early. Escarole chopped rough, beans drained and added, garlic smashed, not minced, smashed to release flavour without waste. Salt measured carefully. Water poured in. Sometimes a drizzle of olive oil, sometimes none. And then it simmered, slowly, for hours. The bitterness of the escarole softened, the beans turned creamy, the liquid thickened into something hearty, something serious. This wasn't delicate food. This was food meant to sit heavy in the stomach and stay there. Monday night, it was fresh. Tuesday, it was better. Wednesday, it was reinvented. Maybe with pasta stirred in, maybe poured over bread. Thursday, it was the last bowl scraped from the pot. No one complained, because everyone understood the system. This dish represented immigrant intelligence, understanding that survival wasn't about one good meal, it was about consistency, about stretching effort across time, about making sure no day ended with an empty stomach. In Italy, this was peasant food. In America, it became armor. 7. Boiled potatoes with salt and oil when the cupboard was empty. Every family knew this meal. Nobody talked about it, because this was the food you ate when there was nothing else. End of the month, payday still days away. No pasta, no beans, no bread, just potatoes. Always potatoes. They were peeled slowly, cut into chunks, dropped into salted water, boiled until soft. No butter, no milk, no cheese. Drained, placed in a bowl, sometimes drizzled with olive oil, if there was any left. Often there wasn't. And that was dinner. This wasn't comfort food. This wasn't tradition. This was survival stripped to its core. But potatoes did their job. They filled the stomach. They kept hunger away long enough for the next day to come. People didn't collapse. They didn't give up. They ate their potatoes and went to bed. And in the morning, they got up and went back to work. This dish didn't inspire nostalgia. It inspired endurance. 8. Pasta with leftover meat drippings. Sauce made from memory. Sunday was the only day meat appeared in many households. a small roast, a single chicken, something modest. But the real treasure wasn't the meat. It was what stayed in the pan. The drippings, the fat, the browned bits stuck to the bottom. Those were saved. Water was poured into the pan. The bits were scraped loose. The liquid was poured into a jar and kept for the week. Later, when pasta was cooked, those drippings were reheated, thinned with pasta water, poured over noodles. And suddenly, plain pasta tasted like meat. Children thought it was something special, something rich, something important. It was illusion, but a beautiful one. This was culinary magic, stretching one Sunday meal into 3 weekday dinners, making absence feel like presence.
And suddenly, plain pasta
This was how
tasted like
mothers
meat.
protected their families.
Children
from
thought it
feeling
was something
poor.
special.
9. Eggs scrambled with onions and peppers, sharing without counting. Eggs were expensive, so they were stretched. 2 eggs, maybe 3, beaten in a bowl, bulked up with onions, peppers if they were in season, cooked slowly, then divided. 6 people, 7 people, everyone got a little. Always served with bread, lots of bread. Nobody argued, nobody complained. Children learned early that fairness didn't mean abundance, it meant inclusion. The mother always took the smallest portion. Always. This dish taught generosity through practice, not words. 10. Plain polenta, fuel for the working man. Cornmeal was cheaper than wheat. That's why polenta appeared. Water boiled, salt added. Cornmeal poured in slowly, stirred endlessly. No butter, no cheese, no sauce, just polenta. Thick, heavy, filling. It wasn't exciting, but it stayed with you. A man could eat polenta at dawn and work until nightfall without hunger returning. This was labor food, worker food. In northern Italy, it had sustained generations. In America, it did the same. Polenta didn't care where you were. It showed up when needed. 11. Cabbage cooked with garlic and vinegar. Borrowed food from borrowed neighborhoods. Little Italy did not exist in isolation. It was stitched tightly against Jewish blocks, Irish tenements, German boarding houses. Walls were thin. Smells travelled. Food travelled even faster. Cabbage was not traditionally Italian food, not like pasta or beans, but cabbage was cheap, cheaper than almost anything else, and the neighbours were cooking it, big pots of it. Italian families noticed. A whole head of cabbage cost almost nothing. It lasted, it filled a pot, and so it entered Italian kitchens, not as tradition, but as necessity. The cabbage was chopped roughly, thrown into a pot with garlic sizzling in oil. Water added just enough to soften it, salt measured carefully, and then vinegar, sharp, biting, cutting through the heaviness. The result was simple, pungent, filling. It didn't taste like Italy. It tasted like New York. This dish represents something important: adaptation without pride. Immigrants did not cling rigidly to tradition. They borrowed, they learned, they absorbed what worked. Food wasn't about identity politics. It was about survival. And cabbage worked. 12. Onion soup with stale bread, when flavour came from patience. Onions were cheap, always available. Even in the hardest weeks there were onions, so they became meals, sliced thin, cooked slowly in oil or fat, not rushed, slowly until they softened, until sweetness emerged. Water added, salt, sometimes garlic, no stock, no meat, just onions and thyme. Stale bread was dropped into the soup to thicken it, to give it body, to make it feel like more than water and vegetables. This soup was eaten quietly, slowly, late at night. It was warm. It was honest. This was the kind of food that didn't impress anyone, but it kept families alive. 13. Tripe cooked in tomato water, eating what others wouldn't. Tripe was cheap because nobody wanted it. That made it perfect. Italian immigrants were used to eating every part of the animal. Back home, nothing was wasted. In America, butchers practically gave tripe away. It was cleaned, washed, boiled for hours until tender, cooked with tomato water, not sauce, just the watery leftovers. Garlic, salt. The smell was strong, the texture unfamiliar. But it was protein, it was filling, it was affordable. This dish separated those who could afford preference from those who couldn't.
Unfamiliar, but it was
And
protein,
no one
it was
apologized
filling,
for eating
it was affordable.
14. Fried peppers on bread, when vegetables became the meal. Peppers were cheap in season, bought by the sack, sliced, fried slowly in oil, garlic added. The peppers collapsed into sweetness. The oil carried everything. Piled onto bread, that was lunch. That was dinner. Simple, satisfying, bright. Children remembered this dish fondly, not because it was fancy, but because it tasted alive. 15. Rice cooked in milk. Dinner that became dessert. Rice was filling. Milk was precious. Together they became something comforting. Rice simmered slowly in milk, stirred so it wouldn't burn. A little sugar added if available. It was eaten warm, shared. Sometimes it was dinner, sometimes dessert, sometimes both. This dish softened hard days. 16. Salt cod stewed with potatoes. Preserved food for uncertain times. Fresh food was unreliable, refrigeration barely existed, ice cost money, and work hours were long. So Italian immigrant families relied heavily on food that could wait. Salt cod was one of those foods. It arrived hard as wood, white with salt, stiff and unforgiving. Before it could be eaten, it had to be soaked for days. The water was changed again and again to pull the salt out slowly. This wasn't convenience food. This was commitment. Once softened, the cod was cut into chunks and simmered with potatoes, garlic, and water. Sometimes onions, sometimes a drizzle of oil if there was any left. No herbs, no wine, no extras. The potatoes absorbed the fish flavor. The broth turned cloudy and rich despite having almost nothing in it. Salt cod wasn't loved, but it was trusted. It didn't spoil, it didn't surprise you. It showed up when needed. In immigrant kitchens, reliability mattered more than pleasure. 17. Tomato bread soup, Papa style, when bread became the meal. Bread never went to waste, ever. When bread became too hard to eat, it wasn't thrown away, it was transformed. Old bread was broken into pieces and dropped into boiling water with garlic and tomato remnants. Not full sauce, just tomato water, skins, seeds, whatever remained. The bread swelled, thickened the pot, turned liquid into substance. Salt added, oil if possible. This soup wasn't eaten for flavor. It was eaten for warmth and fullness. It was quiet food, the kind eaten late at night when everyone was tired. This dish carried centuries of peasant wisdom. Bread doesn't expire, it changes form. 18. Fried eggs in tomato sauce, making one egg feed many. Eggs were valuable. Tomato sauce was cheaper, so the sauce did most of the work. A thin tomato sauce simmered in a pan. Garlic, salt, maybe onion. Then eggs cracked directly into it, one by one. The eggs poached gently. Yolks stayed soft. One egg could be stretched across several plates when served with bread. This dish looked rich. It felt abundant. It wasn't. But it created the illusion of generosity, and that illusion mattered. 19. Stuffed peppers without meat, when tradition met reality. Stuffed peppers existed long before meat was removed. Breadcrumbs, rice, onion, garlic, oil. No beef, no pork. The filling was stretched. The peppers were baked slowly until soft. Children didn't miss the meat. They'd never known it regularly. This dish represents compromise. Tradition reshaped by poverty, not erased, adjusted. 20. Apple scraps compote, sweetness from refuse. Apples were peeled carefully. The peels and cores were saved, boiled with water, sometimes sugar, sometimes nothing. Cooked until soft and spoonable. This was dessert. Children waited for it, because sweetness was rare. This dish taught that even scraps could feel special. 21. Chestnuts, roasted or boiled. The food that followed them across the ocean. Chestnuts were not a novelty to Italian immigrants. They were memory food. Back in Italy, especially in the mountains and poorer rural regions, chestnuts had sustained entire villages for centuries. When wheat failed, when crops were lost, when money disappeared, chestnuts remained. So when immigrants arrived in New York with almost nothing, they gravitated toward what felt familiar. Street vendors sold chestnuts cheaply, especially in colder months. Roasted in carts, wrapped in paper, still warm in your hands. Sometimes families bought them. Other times they bought raw chestnuts and cooked them at home. Boiled in water, roasted directly on stovetops, split open with knives. Chestnuts weren't exciting, but they were filling, starchy, dense. They replaced bread when bread was scarce. They replaced dessert when sugar was unaffordable. Children ate them slowly, peeling each one carefully. Nothing was rushed, because food wasn't abundant. Chestnuts represented continuity, a reminder that even though everything else had changed, the language, the streets, the work, survival knowledge still applied. The same food that fed their grandparents in Italy was now feeding their children in America. These weren't forgotten foods because they lacked value. They were forgotten because they told an uncomfortable truth, that survival is rarely beautiful, but it is meaningful. These meals built families, neighborhoods, futures, and every plate carried hope.